how do you get from ideas being benign and harmless to being dangerous? That's something I started thinking about when I switched social context, when I moved from an academic environment to working as a truck driver and a more working class environment, where the first thing that really hit me in my face is that the language was significantly different. People were using language in a much more unrefined way. They didn't really care about what you're supposed to say and what you're not supposed to say. There was far less of a filter. The kind of language was not only rude, but it was oftentimes anti-Semitic. Oftentimes you heard really, really stupid jokes being made. And my first reaction was, oh my goodness, where did I land here? It's like almost being surrounded by people who have Nazi-like and fascist-like tendencies. And I really mean this by reference to what I learned about fascism and Nazism in school. And I was socialized in Austria, so Austria is particularly, I think, sensitive when it comes to the topics of fascism. So you kind of learn about the kind of language that was used during the time of Nazism. You learn about the kind of slurs that people are using. You learn about how people were socially organizing. And you learn to be careful about that. And you think that just by avoiding that language and not using that language and being particularly sensitive to this kind of language, you can actually avoid the phenomenon itself. And now I fell into a working class environment in which this language was not taboo. It was just used all the time while making anti-Semitic jokes, for example. And at first I felt like, oh my goodness, this environment, I can't live in this environment because I'm obviously surrounded by people who have evil intentions and who basically meet textbook characteristics of how to be a bad person. The first time this started actually breaking for me was that I myself, as a migrant, didn't face any kind of discrimination when I was meeting people in person. So there was a kind of disconnect between the kind of language they use and the way you treat you. It was largely basically decent and fair. And I saw this happening with others as well. It was like there was a disconnect between how the language is being used and how people are actually acting. And this made me think and think about, like, what is different here? Like, why do people not behave in the way that their language would imply they are behaving? And is it just to mask off? I mean, this is something that I've heard from progressive friends. Oh, they're just hiding their fascist tendencies. They're just hiding their racist tendencies. But at the heart of it, they are racists, and they hate foreigners. Is it that? Or is it just that when you put a person into a context of acting, a social context, it's different from when you put a person into a context of just randomly speaking their mind? And what I figured out at the course of time was that when people are using in those contexts the language without much of a filter, what they are doing is they're playing with basic assumptions that are very human in nature. For example, many of the jokes that are being made have something to do with the basic distinction between us, a sense of we are here, and the others are there, the foreigners. And this is a foundational human experience. I mean, everybody has this, including progressives. We all have a sense of us versus them. And it is basically playing with this basic human experience of making the distinction between. I can clearly remember when I was a kid and I was traveling home to Bulgaria in the bus, and once we crossed the border, one of the children there started singing, right, nationalist songs, how he's happy to be back home. So the distinction between home and not home is something very foundational that every human being basically knows and understands. This is something just as close to us as the notion of a mother. Everybody understands what the word means, and everybody has a very, very specific image and sense for what mother means. And the jokes that are being made were basically, again, on the lines of playing with who you are, what you experience to be yours, and who the others are, or what you experience to be foreign. And as long as you then placed these same people into a different social context where they were confronted with otherness, in a reasonable degree, they acted very differently. So the otherness was not that much of a problem, but it was actually much easier for them to socialize with people who were different from them. And this seemed to be, for me, a context of in which ideas are benign and relatively harmless, and basically an expression of generally human nature, of how we are, of basic distinctions that we make, and not really problematic. But the moment you start overreacting to the language use itself, and the moment you start labeling the people immediately without experiencing them in context, without talking to them, without just doing things together with them, the moment you do that, they shift their language use from just being a silly joke, a side joke, and then being able to switch their frames and actually be not only polite, but actually showing compassion for people who are different and actually helping people who are different. This is something that I've observed all the time. You have this discrepancy between, on the one hand, using language in a kind of insensitive way, but the next moment, that's the same person who helps you and is there, and you have trouble with the truck, and they're there and they're helping you, and they're spending a lot of time to actually really help you figure things out. And you're thinking, is this the same person? How does this go together? It's the same person from whom you heard something that was sounding not very kosher, and the next day that the same person is there available for you and really giving their lifetime to help you figure things out. And as long as you can switch these contexts in everyday life, I think ideas and language is not a problem. But if you overreact to the language and see it as expressive of the nature of the human being who is speaking to you, what happens then is that people start sticking to their language. They start then seeing their language as expressive of their own group identity. They start to form a group identity around the language that you just deemed to be unacceptable. So in other words, you are co-creating the group identity. You are creating a social entity, a group that wasn't there in the first place. This was a really, really weird phenomenon. So, in other words, it's not something that just happens from and by itself, from its own agency, but it's something that you co-create with the way you treat them. And that's when I believe ideas then really become dangerous, because what happens then is that the joke is not a joke anymore. The language is not just, random language use anymore, but the joke becomes a symbol for who you are within a group identity, and a separated group identity that has somebody who experiences them as foreign, somebody who experiences them as dangerous. So people start to converge around the language use. It's not just something that they do and then they stop and they use different language and they act together, but they start to focus more and more on the language itself, because the language becomes expressive of their group identity. And that's when I believe ideas really start to become dangerous. They start to become dangerous because they are not just immediately expressive of a mental state and of a mental impulse that you have, and you want to express something. It might be something stupid, it might be something intelligent, but then they start to become expressive of a group identity, and it's something that they weren't at the beginning. And I believe we can observe this process happening on a global level. On a global level, where certain sentences in the beginning, they're relatively benign, and they're followed up by other sentences which relativize them and show a different frame and a different context of thinking. But the more you overreact to the sentences and think that you will stop the formation of group identity by forbidding people to use this kind of language, the more you actually co-create their social identity. And this is a nightmare. This is a nightmare because basically everything that I've been taught about, like, how do you avoid exactly that happening, doesn't seem to work in practice. Like the things that I was taught, that don't use this kind of language, right? Stay away from this kind of language. That's not the way you disarm it. This is not the way you prohibit it from getting its own and developing its own social identity and group identity. And I don't know how to revert that and how to stop that. But the obvious thing is, again, that the over focus on the language use itself creates and supports the becoming and developing something into a group identity that was just random and fragmented in the first place.